G'day, May 40 here. It's been a little while since I've live streamed, getting a little rusty in the form. But here we are. It's been so good to take a few weeks off because I get to rewire my central nervous system. So you may have had the experience at losing in life at times. You may have been humiliated by life at times. And as a result, you went into a funk. Even you might be described as depressed. And so you stopped doing so much. You stopped exerting yourself so much. You stopped trying to shape things in the world, and you retreated back. You just did what was absolutely minimal. And then as a result of that downtime, you started thinking, what would be a new way forward? I just got humiliated. I just got defeated. I didn't like what I just went through. I've lost some valuable connections in my life. I need to rethink how I go about my life. And so that is the adaptive, healthy part of depression, right? That's the evolutionary reason that we get depressed, so that we can stop doing what we habitually do, pause, take a break, and think, is this really the best use of my energy? And then you plot various different paths forward, and then you think about how they might work out in reality, and you discount one, discount another, and then you finally settle on a path forward, and then you gather up your resources and you launch yourself into that new path. And so my new path forward over the past 6 weeks or so has put a lot more effort and energy into my writing rather than my live streaming. And it felt so calming, it felt so centering. Instead, I was just working on developing certain points or arguments or observations in the deepest, most profound, most coherent method that I could, and primarily focusing on those areas where I could make a contribution, where nobody in polite society had written about, yes, it's great to have diversity and to bring new voices into English departments and history departments and philosophy departments and into America in general. And so there are many upsides to diversity. What are the downsides to diversity? Everything comes with trade-offs, but only one side in the diversity story gets talked about. But there are some downsides, for example, when the story of English literature, which is the story of Christian literature, is increasingly analyzed and taught by people who are not Christian and who are foreign to the Christian experience. That's going to give a much more distant relationship to the text. So there was an attack at the White House Correspondents' dinner last night, and here are the things that grab my attention. One, it's just another massive security failure, which is partly on Donald Trump, because he chose the Secret Service director, just as he chose the one that he brought in when he took office in 2017. And the Secret Service is not very good. The reason that there haven't been more successful presidential assassinations is partly because the Secret Service has done some good work, but a lot of it is just luck. This guy did not have a particularly strong plan, but that he got 60 feet past security. And you see video of Secret Service agents drawing their guns, and that there are so many pauses and hinks and hassles, and they have the hardest time getting their gun out. He just streaked 60 feet past them, which strikes me as an incredible security failure. And this guy also talked about all the security failures. He had absolute contempt for the level of security. That's one thing that jumps out at me. Another thing that jumps out is, did this guy have a life worth defending? Did he have great things going on in his life? Did he love people, and was he loved by people? I can't imagine that this guy, despite an impressive resume, despite having a degree from Caltech and a master's degree and looking awesome on his resume, I just can't imagine that he had a life worthy of defending. If you've got nothing to lose, then you're much more likely to engage in this reckless behavior, which is why I think we need some kind of vouch system. There should be all sorts of privileges, such as staying at a Hilton that hosts the White House Correspondents' dinner, only if you can have a certain number of law-abiding adults vouch for you, and then if you misbehave, then everyone who vouched for you should have to pay some of the penalty. You should not be able to get a driver's license unless you have at least 10 law-abiding adults who are willing to vouch for you. You should not be allowed to fly on a plane unless you have 10 law-abiding adults vouching for you. There should be all sorts of privileges that only come with a large number of respectable, law-abiding adults who vouch for you. Right? This is Fox News.
Is now refusing to talk. Meantime, authorities are going door to door in his neighborhood and speaking to his family. Christina Coleman is live outside that suspect's home. Christina.
Hi, John. Yeah, that's right. We're here just in front of the alleged gunman's house. It's been very busy. As you can see, it's not blocked off or anything right now. There's been plenty of neighbors, plenty of people walking by. We've talked to a few of them. None of them say they knew him, but they all said that they are concerned about this situation.
Wow, so it's possible that none of his neighbors did know him, which does feed my premonition that this is someone leading a largely isolated life.
Take a look at this video. We saw the FBI speaking with neighbors who live here on the alleged gunman street. Federal authorities identified the suspect as 31-year-old Cole Allen of Torrance. And take a look at this. Hours earlier, authorities also swarmed this area. The FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office executed a search warrant at Allen's home overnight. Sources also tell Fox News that the alleged shooter's parents have been cooperating with authorities.
Law enforcement, you're right, executed multiple search warrants last night, not only in Los Angeles, but also in Washington, D.C., in the hotel room where the suspect was staying.
And more on his background. Cole Allen's LinkedIn page indicates he graduated from Caltech back in 2017 with a mechanical engineering degree and later earned a master's degree. He also worked as a tutor for a local tutoring and test prep center. That was his current job. A post on his LinkedIn page indicated that his employer named him Teacher of the Month sometime last year. Well,
now that is not a great job. Right, that is not the job of someone who's thriving in life, even if his employer named him Teacher of the Month.
Allen is in big trouble following his alleged attack on law enforcement last night. He remains in custody. Federal authorities say after that shooting last night, Allen's brother notified police in Connecticut of an alleged manifesto that Allen had sent to his family members. The White House also confirmed that Secret Service police interviewed Allen's sister and said that she said her brother had a tendency to make radical statements and that his rhetoric constantly mentioned a plan to do something to fix the, quote, issues with today's world. Authorities also confirmed Allen purchased 2 handguns and a shotgun and kept them at their parents' home and that they were unaware that he was storing them there. They also said he had attended a No Kings protest here in California at some time. And sources also tell Fox News that after Allen's arrest last night, he admitted to law enforcement that he intended to target Trump administration officials.
It is clear, based upon what we know so far, that this individual was intent on doing as much harm and as much damage as he could.
These allegations clearly very disturbing. Also, Allen's arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow in federal court. John?
Who else lives in that house? Do we know, Christina? Is that his parents' house, or did he live there alone with somebody else? Do we know?
Well, we believe he was here with his parents. And again, we're told that they are cooperating with authorities. We have not seen anybody here since we have been here this morning today. It's very clear, but law enforcement very meticulous in their efforts, going door to door, questioning neighbors, seeing what they can get. And again, I heard one of them saying they're looking for Ring camera video. So clearly they're trying to see what activities and what behavior he had leading up to that shooting last night, John.
All right, Christina Coleman in Torrance, California. Thank you, Christina. Let's bring in now former FBI agent Nicole Parker. She is a Fox News contributor. Nicole, this event is less than 24 hours old now, but the FBI wheels are already spinning, I'm sure. What's going on in terms of ballistics, psychological profiling, credit card histories, that kind of thing?
Well, those are all very important questions and key elements to this investigation. Obviously, ballistics will be looked at very closely. Our evidence response team, also known as ERT at the FBI, showed up to the scene immediately to the lobby of the hotel. They gather all of the evidence in a way that would be perfectly ready to appear in court because, as we know, this individual is still alive and there will be a court proceeding, and I do believe that he will receive the fullest extent of the law. So that's very important. The way that they gather the evidence is crucial. The way that it will be investigated, the ballistics will be sent off to the Quantico lab for the FBI. And they're the best of the best, and I have no doubt that they will put together a very strong case from that regard. When we talk about the credit card charges, that's extremely important. They want to see his spending patterns What was he doing?
So let's say you're in that White House ballroom. This is the other thing that jumped out at me. So Secret Service and police are telling you to get down. Now, I'm not someone who says you should always listen to the experts, and I'm not someone who says you should never listen to the experts. In that kind of situation, you should listen to the experts. Right? You're putting multiple lives at risk because by standing up and staying standing, by not getting down, you're reducing the line of sight for law enforcement. So the security was not very good. This guy got 60 feet past the barrier is not a good sign. But even when you're dealing with institutions and experts who are flawed, that doesn't mean you should automatically just discount their directions. So the people didn't get down when they were told to, but instead they were there with their phones, making sure they got the hot action video. That strikes me as socially irresponsible. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Eli Lake had something interesting to say. He was at this dinner.
Not to do the, like dramatic, you were there and tell us how you felt and all of that, but you were there. Tell us how you felt. Okay. So this was, we should say that the suspect is in custody. The actual shooting, the event happened, like a floor above the actual ballroom. But where my table was, is to understand that the Washington Hilton Ballroom is such where there's kind of an outer ring and then another ring and then in the center and then there's a big stage. I was at the outer ring in the sort of area of the CBS Free Press tables, and we heard gunshots. In fact, I smelled, and others around me smelled gunpowder. Wow. And then everybody, and then what we could see, if you can, so you're at a table, everyone's in tuxes and gowns, and then we could see that there was one security person who had his weapon drawn, and that was what we saw from inside the ballroom. So most people, and this was an interesting observation, is that I think the younger people had been used to the school shooter drills, and they all immediately, a lot of people immediately kind of got to the floor, crouched under the table or the chairs. And then those of us who were older than that era, we were a little bit confused. And then you started seeing everybody kind of turning on their cell phone cameras to sort of get anything they could. And it was unnerving, because
so I had no intentions of doing a live stream today. I think I got so ticked off by Brian Stelter. Right, I am only here due to Brian Stelter, because I just thought Brian Stelter's framing was ridiculous. So this is how CNN's media correspondent covered the attack. What happened last night might have seemed extraordinary, right, to the people who were there. But we need to say out loud that it was all too ordinary. In America, this is all too common. A shots fired moment, a chaotic lockdown, a spasm of violence. It is all too ordinary in a tiny part of America, not in America in general. This is just a ridiculous point. Brian Stelter here is performing a left-wing coalition move, right? He says this targeted political assassination attempt against the president and his cabinet. It's just another generic story about American gun violence, and he's using the event to try to make the case for essentially where we need more gun control. Right? The shooter wrote a manifesto naming Trump administration officials as targets by rank. He took a train across the country. He attended No Kings protests. He donated to Kamala Harris. He belonged to a left-wing group called the Wide Awakes. None of this appears in Brian Stelter's column. Instead, he just dissolves all the particulars into a general category. Right? He equates the White House Correspondents' dinner with what ordinary Americans go through. Right? This is ridiculous. This is not what ordinary Americans go through. It's what a tiny subsection of Americans go through. And then this is how he completes the piece. There won't be any substantive discussion about access to weapons. There just won't. Right? This is advocacy disguised as an observation. Right? He roots the whole discussion to gun policy and away from the manifesto, the train ride, the targets. Now, imagine if a Trump supporter taken a train to a Democratic Party gathering with a manifesto naming senior Democrats, targeting them by rank. Do you think the framing would be a story about what ordinary Americans experience at the grocery store? I suspect that the shooter's right-wing ideology would have been central. His radicalization path would have been examined. right, the rhetoric of the left-wing coalition, of the right-wing coalition, would have been implicated. Right, so this column tells you which particular tribe, which particular political coalition Brian Stelter sits inside, and what tacit rules govern how this type of violence gets coded when it travels in different directions. So violence from the left, right, gets coded as just generic gun violence. Violence from the right gets coded as right-wing political violence and right-wing extremism. So Brian Stelter presents himself as a truth teller against power. But when the violence comes from his own left-wing coalition, the script breaks, right? He will not indict his own side. He'll only indict generic gun violence. It just seems like a weird framing. To me, the number one story here is the shoddy security that we have coming down from the Secret Service and the other law enforcement officers that it cooperates with. Right? To me, that's the number one story. And then whatever drove this particular shooter. And I don't think there are good guys and bad guys, so that the right wing are just usually good guys and the left wing are bad guys. That's not how I view life.
You know, at all of a sudden, you started. Then I can tell you what you started seeing was members of the cabinet were being rushed to a safe room, and that happened. That was happening kind of in my area. So you saw Hegseth and Kash Patel and Scott Bessent who were there. And just as a matter of background for the listeners, the White House Correspondents' Dinner is, a fancy black tie event where big news organizations will have guests who are usually cabinet secretaries or people like that at their table. So it's not just the press and then the president who's on the dais who would address it. The whole room is filled with senior government officials. A lot of lobbyists will go, of course, journalists, but it's really kind of a Washington insidery elite vibe.
We should describe it as follows. So I went to it, 20 times in my life. And it's one of the biggest rooms you will ever be in. It's a gigantic ballroom. It fits 3,500 people seated. Just as, so like that means there are 300 tables in the ballroom. And as you mentioned, the ballroom's a little like the Globe Theater or something. Like it's got levels.
And this is the same hotel where Ronald Reagan was shot back in 1981.
Sort of like, and so it's enormous, and it's downstairs from the lobby. So you actually descend to the ballroom, and all the security stuff is above. And I think probably before we even get going, it's worth pointing out that my initial reaction when I was reading about this, hearing about it, is, oh my God, this is another Secret Service scandal that's about to hit. And that's clearly unfair and untrue and unjust. What actually happened is what is exactly supposed to happen. He tried to breach security by already being in the building and then dashing past the Secret Service, and they took him down. And so the Secret Service did exactly what it was supposed to. Everybody in the ballroom did exactly what they were supposed to. This is not a failure. It's a success of the process. So the fact that you saw someone's...
All right. I don't think that comment is going to age well. So the shooter ridiculed what he called lax security at the hotel. He said Iranian agents could have easily brought more dangerous weapons to the venue, according to a text message that he'd sent. So I'm quite skeptical that this shows the Secret Service in good light. All right, there's some funny memes with Donald Trump looking cool and collected while everyone around him is freaking out. And the meme says, first time. And wow, see how fast that Secret Service agent drew his weapon? Like, look how he struggles to get his weapon out. All right, okay, so this guy goes 60 feet past. All right, look, and then look at this struggle. What? Like, it takes him about 2 seconds. So a pro quarterback can release the ball in about a quarter of a second. All right, this Secret Service agent. Right, it takes him 1, 2, 3, about 3 seconds to draw his weapon. Right? That does not strike me as someone particularly skilled at his job. Right? That just strikes me as shoddy. Really? You're going to praise that as some great work here? Right. So here's a little bit about the
college student Cole Allen developed a prototype for a wheelchair emergency brake.
The wheelchair brakes tend to lock the wheels, but don't actually lock the chair to the ground. The idea with this is to prevent it from moving at all.
Recent Aging into the Future conference held by St. Barnabas Senior Services and the Eisner Foundation offered a test run on products that have the potential to enrich the lives of seniors.
14 different tech startups got to present to over 350 people in the hopes of getting their projects into some sort of senior health facilities.
So
college student Cole Allen developed
publicity whore, and I would suspect that a good part of his reason for attacking President Trump and his cabinet is to get more of that publicity. Why does he so desperately need that publicity? I suspect he doesn't have many real people in his real life who love him and care about him. Right? I think we're going to find a lot of trouble. So, according to this story, he wasn't a drifter. He was a mechanical engineer from Caltech, a former student researcher at NASA's Elite Jet Propulsion Laboratory, computer science with a master's degree. Right. He's into video games, publicly recognized as Teacher of the Month by his employer. Right. On paper, his trajectory reads as stable, even successful. Donated Kamala Harris. I don't think we're going to find a happy guy. Right? You really think this is someone with a life that works? Count me as skeptical.
Gun drawn that instantly the security for the cabinet members made their moves. The security on the dais for the vice president and for the president made their moves instantaneously. Is one of the first good pieces of good news relating to the Secret Service that I can remember in the last couple of years, which usually has revolved around difficulties, problems, mistakes, errors, and of course,
this was a really shoddy attack. So the security struck me as shoddy, and this guy's attack struck me as shoddy. I think that this attacker is an underearner. Right? Let's look at the symptoms of underearning from Underearners Anonymous. Time indifference. We put off what must be done. We do not use our time to support our own vision and further our own goals. I don't think he really studied and planned out what he was trying to do. Idea deflection. We compulsively reject ideas that could expand our lives or careers and increase our profitability. Right? I suspect that he had his idea deflection shield on, so better ideas that might have led him down a more productive path, he would just automatically reject. Compulsive need to prove, right? Some people will try to shoot the president just to prove that they have value. Clinging to useless possessions. I wonder if he's a hoarder. Exhaustion, right? I wouldn't be surprised if we see that pattern in his life. Giving away our time, right? I think he gave away a lot of time here to attack Trump's cabinet, but I don't think it was delivering a great deal of benefit to him. Undervaluing and underpricing. Do you think he was putting appropriate level of value on his life when he threw it all away in this stupid attempt? Isolation. We choose to work alone when it might serve us much better to have co-workers, associates, or employees. I don't think he had any associates or co-workers or employees on this assassination attempt. Physical ailments. Sometimes out of fear of being larger, we experience physical ailments. So I wonder what kind of chronic physical ailments this guy might have had. Misplaced guilt or shame. We feel uneasy when asking for or being given what we need or what we feel we are owed. Suspect that's going to show up. Not following up, right? Do you think he's really followed up on opportunities, leads, connections? People will only extend themselves to you once, maybe twice, definitely not more than 3 times. So we make bids for other people's attention. We may call them, we may text them, we may suggest getting together. And if you turn someone down, they're not likely to ask you again. If you turn them down 3 times, if someone makes a bid 3 times for your attention, right, that's it, you're out. And so you may move into a community, as I've done many times, and think, oh, I'm just going to do so well here. But you just start turning down bids, and people just start tuning you out from day one. And it's very, very difficult to make that up. Stability, boredom. I suspect that this guy was not thrilled with his life. I suspect that you will find a trail of unnecessary conflicts with co-workers, with family, with acquaintances, neighbors, supervisors, clients, generating problems resulting in financial distress, psychological distress, social distress. I don't think we're looking at a big winner here.
The great failing at Butler, Pennsylvania, of not having had someone on the roof where the shooter took the shot at the president. Although even he himself said last night in his statement that he doesn't even hold this.
And the chat says, I'm surprised he was functional enough to have a teacher job, but he didn't have like a fair dinkum real teacher job. He was a tutor, right? He could tutor someone for an hour here, an hour there, right? Most high-level tutors I know are chronic underearners. This is a classic job for people who are far more talented than they are able to pull off in real life and build something worthy of their talents. That's my experience with tutors, right? If you're making a living by tutoring, 98% of the time, in my experience, it indicates that you're unable to build a real life.
Secret Service, he's not upset because the sniper on the other side of the roof took the guy who shot at him down and.
Great comment here by Bob. I have a rule for myself. If anyone asks me out for a coffee or anything social, I always try to say yes or offer an alternative date. Because these invites, they get rarer and rarer as you age, right? As a 59-year-old man, let me say that is true.
4 seconds. He instantly made it and did his job. Anyway, I just thought it's worth pointing out this is a colossal room. The president was never at any, and nobody, as it turns out, was at any.
Just imagine if there were a team of attackers and they were competent.
Actual physical risk because he never got down the stairs even to the ballroom level.
And I can tell you that the security at the Washington Hilton, which is, by the way, the same hotel where President Reagan was shot in 1981, was extraordinary in the sense.
So Rabbi Judah says playing video games is a big red flag. I don't think it's a red flag, but it often correlates with someone who is not socially well adjusted. All right, just playing video games, not a red flag, but if you're excessively into video games, very likely a red flag.
Sense that even to get, you have to understand there's a huge kind of traffic circle before you get to the actual hotel. So even to get into that traffic circle, which abuts.
How was he even in the hotel with weapons? That was a huge security failure.
Connecticut Avenue, there was security. I had to show the electronic version of my ticket, and then I had to pick up a physical ticket, and every floor you had to present the ticket and your identification. There was a huge...
Probably a very bad idea to have so many cabinet officials and the vice president and the president all in the same place.
Huge. The security was excessive, and I had not been to this in 10 years. And it was much more intense than I had remembered going, because I've gone to a lot of these as well. And then another thing that's different is I don't know if you remember back in the day, John, but every news organization would have for an hour, a cocktail hour, and they would have a room or something. But you could go from room to room and say hi to your friends at Fox News or the Washington Post or whatever. This time, you had to pretty much be in one of the media rooms. So I was at the CBS Free Press thing, but I could not then go into, I don't know, the Washington Post.
Right. So again, this is worth describing.
Yeah.
So anyone who's been to a convention hotel, right? There are rooms on the convention floor where there are 20 or 30 different rooms for breakout sessions and things like that.
Right.
And at the Correspondents Center, every single one of those rooms, and then some of them also.
And another sign this guy was off is that he was another Epstein fanatic and pedo panic peddler. Right? He says, I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes. Obsession with the Jeffrey Epstein case is often another mark of someone with very badly misplaced priorities and something screwy with them.
So had outdoor.
There's nothing shocking that a rich guy would have sex with a lot of women and pay them, including women who are... some of them were 15, 16, 17, right? That doesn't mean that there's a whole Epstein class. It means that when you have the means, you're able to indulge your fantasies and you're able to pay people to please you.
Door space. There's sort of an interior garden patio inside the sort of the circular building that is the Washington Hilton. And so the whole thing of the dinner was almost incidental to this first hour and a half, where you would walk from room to room. 40, 50, 60 different news organizations would have their own little party. And you would go, and if you were somebody like me who had worked at 4 or 5 different places, it was like old home week. You would go to one, you would see people you worked with 10 years ago, and then you would see these people. And then at each party, there would be a celebrity guest or two in the early years that I went.
And Bob says, how many books, physical books, do you have to own before it becomes a red flag? It becomes a red flag if it's getting in the way of you doing things that would serve you better than the possession of those books. So if they're a mess, if they are exerting a toll on your life, I physically feel the burden of a lot of stuff, right? One of the fastest ways that I know to feel better is to clean and to organize and to get rid of unnecessary belongings. So any part of our life is often a painfully accurate reflection of a pattern going on throughout our life. So if your bathroom is dirty, right, there's likely a lot of smudge throughout your life. If your books are a mess, if they're a burden to you, if they're getting in the way of normal human relations, then that's probably a problem you've got going on all through your life. That's just my experience.
In the 80s, those were always senators, congressmen, or cabinet officials. And then when Clinton hit the scene in 1992, it became a Hollywood spectacle.
Yes.
And then suddenly A-list celebs were all coming. The great moment that changed the White House Correspondents' Center was not when, like, Barbra Streisand started coming. It was in 1986 when the brilliant, late, hilarious editor-writer, all-around good guy person, Mike Kelly, who died tragically in Iraq, was then at the Baltimore Sun, and he invited Fawn Hall, who you may remember.
So this guy, he was a tutor, right? Tyler Robinson, from last year, unemployed. So when you don't have a real job, particularly for a man, right, it opens up all sorts of problems. Luigi, the guy who shot the healthcare CEO, didn't have a real job. Right? Most men, most of the time, need a real 40-hour-a-week job.
Was Oliver North's secretary and an absolutely drop-dead gorgeous model-level woman, and everybody in the room wanted to get a look at Fawn Hall in person, and Mike therefore kind of transformed the dinner, because then it was like, who's this year's Fawn Hall? Can we figure out who's the kind of weird person in the world of politics or that we could invite? And so everyone would go, whoa, the Washington Times had so and so. That's amazing, because Mike was then working for the Baltimore Sun, and so they got a lot of off the page attention. And now if that element of the dinner is sort of done with because of these security procedures that have gotten tighter and tighter, that is another sort of reason why this dinner is probably no longer the kind of unbelievable event that it has been in previous years or decades.
Well, the other big thing is that then there are the after parties. So for years, Bloomberg, of all places, which is not considered like the funnest media outlet, but they would have the premier after party. So I remember one year during the George W. Bush administration, I went to a Bloomberg after party and I met like the cast of The West Wing, to give you a sense. But that was, so the Bloomberg, and there's a famous Andy Ferguson column about Peter Beinart. Do you remember this?
Yeah, we published it. Yeah,
Peter, you guys published, right? Exactly. And and Ferguson is like, Ferguson's like, like Peter's like buttering him up and say, "Oh, can I get tickets?" Because
Andy was a columnist. It was a commentary column, and Andy was then a columnist at Bloomberg, and so he gets this obsequious email from Peter Beinart oh, buddy, I love your work. You're so amazing. It's fantastic. Hey, listen, I just happen to be in the neighborhood. Could I get an invite to the Bloomberg party? So there was a Bloomberg party. There was a Vanity Fair party. This was very...
Yeah, the Vanity Fair party was the other big, superstar thing. And they're usually, by the way, also held at, the embassies. So, this year there was... I didn't end up going to it.
So I got home about 11:30 last night, and I'd heard references to the event, but I really didn't know much till I got home at 11:30. And after I checked the New York Times, I put on Fox News to the top of the hour to get a recap of what happened. I think I looked at CNN, and then one of the first things I did after looking at the New York Times, I wanted to see the live C-SPAN coverage of how the event went down. I've got a thing for watching the live news coverage when things happen. So let's cut to the live C-SPAN.
Any administration, having to write humor for your boss is like the hardest, worst possible job one could have. So generally what they do is they farm it out. So you'll have a bunch of comedy writers. I've heard from some of my Democratic counterparts, they'll go to SNL writers and get jokes in. And I know Republicans do the same. So it's not an easy task, one. Secondly, when you're presenting the jokes to the principal and they're making fun of them, you want to make sure that they get the joke too. So that's also hard, bringing the jokes in that are self-deprecating. Now, getting to your question about Donald Trump, I think he's going to tell a lot of jokes tonight. I just don't know that they're going to be about himself. So I think I'm very curious how he handles this at the dinner.
Karen Bohan, the Trump administration currently has a 48% approval rating. There are some issues going on in our country and in the world. Can this dinner be used as a reset in any way? Does that work?
Definitely not a reset. There is an audience for the dinner, a very big one. People are fascinated by it. I guess it could be a reset potentially in how he deals with the press, should he want to make it that. Traditionally at the dinner, the president gives his speech, is funny, makes fun of the other party, is self-deprecating at times, and the speech almost always closes with a tribute to the free press, and that is an olive branch. And so, arguably a different tone with the press could come out of this. Do I think it will? No.
Okay, here's the argument on the other side, and we heard this on the red carpet from a lot of Trump administration officials. Hey, every reporter that's in there probably has his number on speed dial, and they can just call him directly, and he picks up the phone and he talks to them. Isn't that a free exchange? And every day he holds a news conference. Anytime he's in the Oval Office, here comes the press. Any question is welcome.
That is a really interesting aspect of covering him, because the reporters who cover him, people, when I was editor-in-chief of USA Today, people would be like, oh my gosh, it must be so hard for your reporters to cover this administration because he insults the reporters. But, the thing that people don't think about is what reporters want more than anything else is access, and they get direct access to President Trump.
And Weijia Zhang of CBS currently has direct access to President Trump. This is a live picture of the president and Ms. Zhang talking on the dais. When you write a speech for President Trump, where do you start?
Well, you start with whatever the main topic of the speech is. It's like writing a speech for anybody else. You want to make sure that you're covering those issues and the programs that the administration is putting forward, and making sure that you're hitting all of that, all of those notes. But you also know that when you write a speech for Donald Trump, that he's going to go off script. And so when you're working your way through it, you're looking for those spots where he can go back to items that he's comfortable with, that he'll riff on. But the most part, it's it's like writing a speech for anybody else. You just have to get those pieces in. What I was going to say, just to follow up on your point of access, I always made the argument that President Trump was the most accessible president we've ever had. He doesn't do as many press conferences as others, but he's almost always available on the way to Marine One. He brings the press into the Roosevelt Room, into the Cabinet Room, into the Oval Office, as you mentioned. And that level of accessibility is fantastic. What I heard from reporters was it was also exhausting.
It's exhausting.
Exhausting. And they always had to be prepared. So I did not understand this at the time. I said, well, we're getting...
So this is the live CNN commentary at the time of the attack. And so this is when it's starting to go down. And this is live C-SPAN coverage. This is their live camera in the room. So watch the upper right of your screen.
More access than you've ever had before. And they go, yeah, but not the access we want. And I go, what do you mean by that? And they said, we want to go in there with a list of questions that we've prepared and we're ready.
Okay, so I think this is when something's gone down.
To go
watch
at
the
a
reactions.
Press conference. When we get called in at the moment's notice and have to shout over our other reporters and maybe get to ask one, yes, we have access, but we don't have the quality access, I guess, that they were looking for. And that's a difference.
But I would say that those impromptu moments are quality access.
I see it. Just a second. We have an issue here at the head table.
So it takes C-SPAN about 15 seconds to react.
At the White House Correspondents' dinner, if we can go to that full screen, it looks like the head table has been evacuated. I saw Oz Perlman talking with Mr. and Mrs. Trump, and they are evacuating. It looks like they're taking all the security folks out of there at this point.
So looking at all the people still staying seated when they were told to get down, sometimes you should listen to the experts. I think it was irresponsible for them to stay up and to be filming rather than getting down and allowing the police to do their job unimpeded.
If we could get closer, and it looks like the ballroom, I cannot see if people are still seated at their tables or not. This is the quietest I've ever seen the dinner. Can we go? We understand that shots were fired here at the dinner, and we'll find out what's going on here shortly. You can.
So there was supposedly going to be protests at the dinner, that reports that journalists were going to walk out. This was a very divided place. But when the situation changed, the whole vibe changed. Situation changed, and suddenly people felt much more strongly united than divided. Right? When they realized that they were possibly under attack, that there'd been shots that have gone off. Right, suddenly the situation changes, and the entire mood and disposition and the phenomenology of the audience change. So what does phenomenology means? It means your lived experience, your first-hand lived experience. And so you want to unite people who are normally at each other's throats, right? Put them into a situation like this, and suddenly they're all on the same page.
I see a lot of, here come the Secret Service. Let's go. Yeah, let's go in full screen here. See if we can hear.
I'm pretty sure that Stephen is Stephen Miller. So in stressed situations like this, people don't usually rise, right? People usually descend to their level of training. And it does not paint a very flattering picture of the security situation.
Karen Bohan, you've been a association president.
Because what ended up happening was I was with the free pressers, right? So we all like found our way to one of the back exits, and we just were like, this thing is probably canceled. It turned out like just the dinner kept.
Well, you can. Star Lion says they're trying to look tough, right? You can perform, but some people did come off as composed, and other people came off as frightened, and other people were taking advantage of the situation, stealing bottles of wine.
Kept going, but we didn't quite know what to do, and because it was all.
So I had a friend who worked for the Firemen's Union in New York City after 9/11. William Ladderwish wrote a book talking about how there were firefighters who responded to the 9/11 attack and engaged in massive amounts of looting and theft. And so her job was to try to push back on these very true, very damaging claims. So yes, there were heroic actions taken by New York City firefighters on 9/11. There was also mass looting and mass theft.
All over the news, my wife was kind of wanting to know, and I just figured it'd probably be good to go home and sort of say I'm all right. And I can tell you that there is an adrenaline rush and then a crash when you kind of the whole thing. So I didn't go to any after parties, but that's kind of a big thing about it. And there was, I don't know if you remember this, John, in your day, but there used to be a kind of, it's like a bragging rights. Oh, I saw you at the.
So I remember when I wrote on the porn industry, and people would be feuding all year, and then everyone would get together at the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, in Vegas, and suddenly just getting together, and in that celebratory party, we're all in Vegas atmosphere, and usually feuds would get forgotten, and people would be more swayed by the situation than by anything else. And at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, both before and after the shooting, right, that situation has such a powerful influence on people that, once again, the situation is often far more important than any internal factor to govern how people behave.
Vanity Fair party, or you wanted to know, there was a certain kind of status as a journalist in Washington that you would get depending on what parties and the more exclusive parties you could be at, and this was a big thing as well.
Yeah, So there was a famous again, like. We're circling around the real subject here, but there was a famous party that a CNN producer named Tammy Haddad had on Sunday, had a brunch.
Yes. I was at that once.
And the Tammy Haddad brunch was where the Washington journalists got to meet, again, the West Wingers, or, again, Barbara Streisand or something like that. And this was one of these events that I think created the conditions under which Trump eventually ended up coming to power. That is this weird world in which journalists, powerful politicians, lobbyists, and Hollywood all commingled, and the sense of rot, of like cultural elitist, clubbable, very un-American, creating this world in which all these people come in. It's very British. Everybody like goes, you're a member of the Groucho Club or something like that. It's not American. And that world, which various people that I knew, like Fred Barnes and others, found really repulsive. I totally enjoyed. I had no problem.
So Star Lion asked, was Trump going to get roasted for the nasty things he said about Rob Reiner after he died? Yes, I expect it. It is jarring. It is a violation of norms. To me, I respect it because it shows a consistency in Donald Trump. He's one of those few people who seems to be more powerful than the situation. Most of us just respond as the situation incentivizes. We say the things that the conversation that we're in incentivizes. We tell people what they want to hear. We adjust to the situation. Donald Trump may do this less than anyone else I know who's highly successful, right? He refuses to go along with the things that you're supposed to say in certain situations. So I like that about him. I realize for most people it's just incredibly disturbing, and I'm sure at times it can disturb me as well. When you watch the news, including of this attack on the White House Correspondents Association dinner, it's worth asking, Right? What gets covered, what doesn't get covered, what questions you're allowed to ask, what questions you are not allowed to ask. And then think about what are the topics, for example, that historians avoid. Because the topics that historians avoid writing, they give you a map of contemporary moral geography. So if you want to understand what are the moral norms that rule us right now, just think about what historians won't write about and understand what's shaping that, right? Why do historians avoid certain topics? And it all has to do with power, where coalitions that constitute power sit, what those coalitions will permit, what they will attack. So how does knowledge get made, including knowledge about this attack? Right. So there was historian Bruce Gilley who wrote a controversial 2017 paper on colonialism, how its net effects were positive, right? And as a result, he got death threats. There was mass resignation from the publication that put out his paper. You don't get historians writing about heritability, research connecting cognitive traits to historical outcomes, right? That would get massive professional and personal sanctions before peer review even begins. Right, African and Arab participation in the slave trade gets very little scholarly attention. The massive scale of pre-Christopher Columbus human sacrifice, right, on a scale of tens of thousands a year, gets very little attention. Death tolls from communism gets very little scholarly attention, from Mao's Great Leap Forward to the Holodomor, the Stalin famine induced in Ukraine, the millions killed by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Right, the collective death toll from communism sits above 100 million, yet this topic gets very little scholarly attention. Islamist conquests and the enormous amount of cultural destruction that they wrought, it's not something you're supposed to write about. Demographic replacement in history, such as in the late Roman West, right, that's taboo because it touches on modern migration debates. Right, the Great Divergence. Right, why some cultures, why some groups, why some people succeed and others not so much, right? Instead, this all gets shrunk down to a single question of Western imperialism, Western theft. Certain groups are overrepresented in finance, science, revolutionary leadership, right? That can't be discussed in a polite company. It's not a polite topic for academic inquiry without drawing massive fire. Biological constraints on the sexual division of labor down through history, not something you can really write about. The origins of Islam, right? The same secular scholarly tools that are brought to bear on the origins of every other religion, including Judaism and Christianity. Not many people are willing to do that with regard to Islam. Right? Chinese archives on the Mao era are closed to scholars who want to count them. Armenian genocide doesn't get much investigation. Sexual roles down through history, right, usually gets presented through the lens of current elite gender norms, right? So why are all these topics getting so little scholarly attention, right? Because it's all about whose ox gets gored, right? Whose coalition is in power and what do they permit? So the Holocaust has become the dominant religion in the West. It anchors the post-World War II European liberal project. It anchors the legitimacy of the Jewish state of Israel. It anchors the moral grammar of anti-racism. Colonial anchors post-colonial state legitimacy, reparations debates, self-understanding of the colonized who are now trained in Western university. Slavery anchors many of America's racial politics. So we have all these topics that already carry a settled moral valence, and any disputing of that settled moral valence brings an attack, and it puts your life and your career at risk. And then avoidance will intensify as the topic approaches the present, right? You can write about the Peloponnesian War, but write about the 2003 Iraq War, more controversial. So the closer events sit to people who can punish a scholar, right? The narrower the acceptable interpretive range. So we have all this fresh evidence on the Iraq War that just sits because people don't want to risk their careers. Then we have all sorts of rules of avoidance on topics you don't talk about and perspectives that you don't publish on, not because there are any explicit written rules, but it's what Stephen Turner calls tacit knowledge. People just understand that you don't talk about certain things. Everything works through coalitions. Group strategies outcompete individual strategies, right? Groups are in power, and they reward narratives that serve the group, and they punish narratives that harm the group. There are sacred hierarchies that are instituted by ruling powers. Right? There's selective amplification of some narratives, and then there is de-amplification of disfavored narratives. There's a reputation economy. Everything you publish signals something about yourself and your position in the order of your profession. And then there are periodic moral panics, such as what we're going through with regard to Jeffrey Epstein, and people are strongly incentivized to engage in massive amounts of self-deception. And there are pretty big taboos on what you can talk about, what you can write about in polite company. And so the institutions, such as our universities, who are supposed to be producing knowledge, right, they're not primarily about the truth. Intellectual life is not primarily about the truth. Academic life is not primarily about the truth.
With it. But this was very much a species of the idea that Washington had become this playground and not a place where serious politics was done, but where people were basically just angling to be part of the American social and political and cultural elite, and you could all do it at once. And this day was one of the days in which you were either in or you were out. And Trump,
correct. It's a little bit. It's a little bit like the Washington D.C. equivalent of the Met Gala,
right?
Where it was just you wanted to be seen, and if there was something wrong, if you were not if you were not invited. I remember I was at one. God, what would have this been? I think this was at the Washington Times, and I remember there was a policy that, because no news organization can give the entire newsroom tickets to go to it too. That's another thing. So just getting in the door, so you get to the actual dinner, let alone the after parties and everything else. That you would be able to get, you could guarantee your seat at the table if you.
So when you're getting the news, when you're getting commentary, think about who is served and who is being hurt by this particular narrative. And think about who is served and who is hurt by the perspective that Adolf Hitler was the ultimate embodiment of evil, and that the Holocaust was the ultimate embodiment of the greatest evil of all time, anti-Semitism. Right? Certain groups are served by this narrative and other groups are hurt. Right? So who is served when Hitler is presented as some kind of metaphysical eruption rather than the political product of historic forces, right? The first coalition is served as the post-war German political class and its successor generations. So by treating Adolf Hitler as this singular evil monster, it permits Germany to integrate into the post-war liberal order. They get to externalize the Nazi period as a discrete pathology rather than as the radicalization of available options in German political life at that particular time. So Germans benefit from this framing. The post-war liberal democratic order benefits. Right? The post-war liberal order, it needs an account of the war that legitimates the post-war settlement. And so a framing where liberal democracy defeats a metaphysical order, right, that supports the moral architecture of the United Nations with its 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Nuremberg Principles, the post-war consensus on rule by experts, and by reducing the range of the political so that people don't get too nationalist or racist. Instead, we need to turn over more and more of the political to experts. So a narrative where liberal democracy defeats evil and race science and nationalism, right? That is quite handy for our ruling elites. Then there are parts of American Jewish institutional life and its counterparts in Israel who benefit from this framing. So when you present the Holocaust as the singular metaphysical evil, that supports certain constructions of identity, certain constructions of politics. Right? It serves certain groups and hurts other groups. Right? If you say that instead of being this metaphysical event, that it is one of a series of comparable horrors that have also occurred in the past century, then that opens up space for all sorts of narratives that various people in power will find threatening. So historical scholarship pays a huge cost if you operate under this metaphysical framing. Comparative genocide studies pays a cost, right? The Armenian, Cambodian, Rwandan, Bosnian, Ukrainian, and Chinese genocides, right? They all share many structural features with the Holocaust. But when you present the Holocaust as the transcendent metaphysical event, then you render less important these other genocides. And Jewish communities pay a price that many of their institutional custodians overlook. When you don't recognize the structural incentives that brought about the Holocaust, then you're living in a story that is fake, and you lose the lessons of structure. Most things happen because of structure, not because of individuals. So the lesson of Hitler as the ultimate in evil is a fancy story that is quite abstracted from reality. Hitler and the Holocaust and World War II were all a result of certain structures and certain situations and certain events. And this framing also weakens the very moral category it claims to protect. If you describe Hitler as the singular metaphysical evil, every figure to whom Hitler is compared then receives some of that moral weight, and so it becomes a polemical term that you use to put people down. So when you hear favorite narratives, right, ask yourself, who is being served by this narrative and who is being hurt?
Who could get the best possible guest.
Right.
So that was another thing. It was like, you were incentivized to, get, I don't know, the deputy secretary of state or something like that, and that would be like, if you could wrangle somebody like that into that, then that would guarantee you as the journalist a chance to sit there. So,
yeah. Okay. So we've now described this event that Trump sort of killed off because, of course, he refused to go during his first term. Then, of course, Biden came in, but there was COVID for 2 years.
Well, we should also just note here how consequential the night has been for Trump in the past.
That's right. Yes. Oh, very important. 2011 White House Correspondents' dinner. Obama made fun of Trump, and it was at that
viciously.
moment. Yeah, because Trump had been backing the birth certificate story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Trump basically was humiliated, and that passion is what sort of like.
So the reason that Trump backed the birth certificate story was not because he found it true, not because he thought it was ontologically sound, right? He backed the birth certificate story because it was a narrative that hurt his enemies and strengthened his friends. The reason people use certain narratives, the reason people favor certain narratives, the reason certain narratives get extolled is because they serve power, they serve particular interests, right? A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Ronnie Goodman on this channel, the philosopher and attorney, and he says that he can't make any sense of heritage Americans, and because he can't make ontological, philosophical, ultimate truth of the narrative, therefore it's somehow inferior. But the value of a narrative has nothing to do with it being true, right? Truth in stories is only a byproduct, right? It can be instrumentally useful, but the power of a narrative has nothing to do with its truth or its coherence or its ontological ultimate truth soundness, and it has everything to do with, does it serve a particular coalition, and does it then hurt that coalition's enemies? So the Obama birth certificate story, right, provided strength and reassurance to people who hated Obama, and it bothered and hurt those people who loved Obama. And whether the story is true or not has nothing to do with why the story was deployed. So just because people deploy a story, right, don't think that it means that there is somehow some profound truth. Right? The whole foundation of our politics, of our theories about politics, of our elite journalism about politics, of our foreign policy, of our institutions, the whole foundation is bogus. It has absolutely nothing to do with truth. So let me just lay out for you some very basic bitch truths that John Mearsheimer laid out in his 2018 book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. And if John Mearsheimer is true here, if he is saying things that are primarily true, then the whole foundation of the way that our political order works is based on lies. So point number one he makes, we are profoundly social beings from the start to the finish of our lives. We are primarily members of groups. Even those of us who are oddballs, eccentrics, right? We're still products of certain groups. We are far more social beings than we are individuals just seeking our own path in life. Right? Now, liberalism, the whole dominant elite political understanding of reality, is a lie. Right? It downplays the social nature of human beings to the point of virtually completely ignoring it. Liberalism, the dominant ideology, treats people as largely atomistic actors, as individuals just making choices. We don't just make free choices. We primarily act in a way that we learn from our upbringing and that benefits the incentives aligned with whatever coalition we're with. So this liberal fixation with rights is based on a fixation of individualist rights, and we are not primarily individuals. That is not how we work. We are primarily members of tribes, of teams, of coalitions. Right? And this protection of human rights is what motivates a lot of liberal states, such as America, to pursue ambitious and ruinous foreign policies, such as invading Iraq. Right? If we are at war with Iran right now to remake their political order, that would be a great liberal blunder. Right? Elite discourse, political discourse, public discourse about liberalism places enormous emphasis on human rights. Right? There are no human rights. This is a made-up category. It may be a useful fiction. It may be a categorical error that does far more harm than good. But this fixation with human rights is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how we operate. We're not primarily individuals. We're primarily parts of groups. But human rights is about the most reverent rhetoric that you get out there in the secular world. But we are not lone wolves. We are born into tribes and groups and extended families, and this shapes us well before we can be individuals. We develop very strong attachments to our group and to our tribe and to our family, and we are naturally willing to make great sacrifices for these we love. We are tribal to our core. We're not individualist to our core. Why are we so social? Why are we not individualist to our core? Because the best way to survive is to be embedded in a group. The more distant you are from the heart of your group, the more you are in danger. Just look at the rest of animal life. If you live outside of the herd, you are less likely to live very long than if you're living in the center of the herd. Right? Our reason is about the least important of the three ways that we determine our preferences. Right? It's less important than how we are socialized, and it's less important than our genetic makeup. Right? We are born with innate sentiments that strongly shape how we think and react to the world around us. We have very limited choice in formulating any kind of moral code. And to the extent that we adopt a hero system, we usually take it from those who are most important to us, those that we love. So if John Mearsheimer is right in these basic truths, the entire edifice of liberal political theory, liberal journalism, liberal education, liberal foreign policy, liberal institutional self-understanding all rests on a fundamental mistake about what human beings are. Right? And this is not some kind of minor technical error. It is categorical, and it is what is producing systematic failure across every domain where that mistake is operating. Right? I think Mearsheimer is unassailably correct here. Reason is the least important of the ways that we determine our preferences. We are profoundly social. We're shaped by those we love and the communities that we grew up in. Right? We don't make moral progress by discovering universal principles throughout rational reflection. Right? What drives us is our connections to the people we love. And if we lack those connections, then we may behave in the erratic way of this particular shooter at the White House Correspondents' dinner.
Led him inexorably into running for president. So it was consequential.
Although, in fairness, Trump was talking about running for president as early as...
No, yeah, I know. But people say that something changed at that dinner. Like that people around him...
And if you watch it, it's believable.
Yeah. So what's interesting...
Weirdly, can I just say, that Trump, for most of his life, and most of his public celebrity career or whatever, would have been exactly the kind of person that you would find at the Vanity Fair after party. Would have been exactly the kind of person who would be the kind of insider rubbing elbows with powerful journalists, and he loved that. And
so,
he
was a TV star. He was himself.
And he was a TV star,
right? TV star, right? So
if Mearsheimer is right, American politics is not between the forces of reason and the forces of tribe. It's between different tribes. And I believe that Mearsheimer is right. Political conflict is not between those who recognize these universal moral principles and human rights and those who remain trapped in their attachments to their guns and their religion. Instead, we have a conflict between different tribal commitments that are packaged differently. So liberal institutionalists are also tribal. They have tribal commitments, but they present themselves as universal. Right? Populist commitments are tribal commitments that present themselves as tribal. The difference is in presentation, not in the underlying structure. Right? Politics is about which tribe will have power. So the institutional dominance of liberal commitments was a political achievement. It was not the triumph of reason over irrationality. The current resurgence of nationalism and populism is not a regression from reason to irrationality. It is the political reassertion of tribal commitments that liberal dominance have tried to suppress. And this framing doesn't make one group superior to the other, right? Reality is a battle between warring groups who make compromises to try to assemble enough support to seize the coercive powers of government.
So, but the dinner stopped being what it had been because people didn't want to come to Washington. So Hollywood didn't want to come to Washington for the dinner, which is essentially supposed to be a celebration of the president. That's the odd part, is that it's the moment where the president makes a speech and he makes jokes about, it's jokey, and he makes jokes about the journalists, but then at the end he says, we're all in this together, we're all Americans, free speech, and, you know, this is the greatest society on earth because we have a free press, and everybody is, you know, applauds each other and drinks and toasts and goes off to parties, and it's a moment of great. Yeah. And Trump last night, interestingly enough, in his remarks, evoked that. He said he congratulated the head of the White House Correspondents Association. Yeah. He said it was a beautiful night. He was looking around the room at how civil and cordial and happy everybody seemed to be, and it was really a beautiful evening, and he wants to restage it. He wanted to come back. It was so nice. And he was.
He was complimentary of everybody.
This is why we need
involved.
A White House ballroom. That was the other part.
That was the interesting thing, is that he was complimentary of literally everybody involved in the project. The White House Correspondents Association, the Secret Service. You know, he said in that press conference, "I'll be the first to complain. I like complaining about the Secret Service. If they did something wrong, the Secret Service was great. The security was great. These guys around me were great. The journalists were great. All the people in the hall who aren't journalists were great. I mean, it was a love-in."
And then he said,
years of not participating.
And then
So I've devoted my last few weeks to studying various elite thinkers, including on constitutional law. And there is a stunning similarity with regard to theorists of democratic theory. And in reaction to it, Stephen Turner, George Mazur wrote a book from 2023, Making Democratic Theory Democratic. Because currently, elite democratic theory is anti-democratic, which seems to be strange. So John Rawls published his A Theory of Justice in 1971, and ever since then we have all these books published with the same aim, to vindicate and explicate something that is called social democracy on philosophical grounds. But what is called social democracy really means rule by experts, rule by unelected experts. So how did this happen? All right, so there is a uniformity among elite democratic theorists that they built their own little niche and nothing else really gets into it. And all the NGOs that fund this type of research are committed to the same agenda, and all the professional incentives are committed to the same agenda. So you get all this similar social democratic theory which rationalizes and makes the argument for we need to be ruled by experts rather than allowing people to have a dominant voice.
He said, I was going to give the most inappropriate speech that has ever been given anywhere, and I still have it, but I don't think if we do this again, I'll be as rough, because I thought that it was a very nice vibe in the room, is essentially what he said. That very unlike him. And of course, he said many things I thought were very interesting. Go ahead, Abe.
Yeah, he seemed to indicate, he didn't spell it out, but he seemed to sort of indicate that the nightmare of it sort of brought them all together in some common way,
right?
That he felt. Yeah.
Right. But I think
can I just get back to the interesting thing about 2011 is that I think 2011, in some ways you could say the really important thing that happened was that Trump was roasted so mercilessly by Obama, because you can argue that it does set the path towards Trump running, of course, in 2016, winning, and here we are in the Trump era. However, at the time, the big news was nobody was aware that as Obama was roasting Trump, he was planning the final parts of the bin Laden raid, which is also a kind of world historic event. So that 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner is one of those important hinges in American history, I suppose. Yeah.
So Christopher Caldwell, such a thoughtful bloke that is about the only person for whom I will subscribe to a magazine just to read his thoughts. And so he's out with a book review in the latest edition of Claremont Review of Books about the coming storm. And it was by a Cold War scholar from Scandinavia who's written about how we're headed for another cataclysm like World War I. And so his review does what his reviews always do, right? He uses all these respectable European sources to dress his paleocompositions in continental clothing. And so Christopher Caldwell, he gets to publish in the New York Times and in all these elite liberal outlets, the New Republic, the Atlantic, the Financial Times, because he makes his case not through paleocon language, right? He uses elites, Yale historians, and various elites on the left to make his paleocon points for him. So he uses his indoor voice. He speaks in the manner that elites want to hear to then frame things in a way that support his paleocon priors. So Christopher Caldwell has been an interesting arc over the past 18 months. I just subscribed to the American Spectator so I could read the last 18 months of his columns. And so his work's interesting because sometimes he praises Trump. Just as often he criticizes Trump's, and plenty of times he neither praises nor criticizes Trump. But he's usually on board with a Catholic paleocon perspective. So his latest pieces are all about how Trumpism is failing. He's writing obituaries for Trumpism because he makes the common mistake of equating Trumpism with a philosophy, of equating Trumpism with a series of political beliefs. Trumpism is another attempt to gain the coercive powers of the government apparatus through forming coalitions, and Trump, like other successful political actors, will adapt and adopt and put out completely contradictory beliefs to try to grab the coercive powers of government. So if you analyze politics through the lens of beliefs, you are sorely mistaken, right? Ask yourself, does this story make evolutionary sense?
I mean, so the event itself is very interesting. It's a as I say, I think there's a element of cultural rot. When I started going in the 1980s, it was a big deal to get the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at your table. And then 10 years later, if you didn't have an Emmy-nominated member of the cast of Caroline in the City, you were a B team or a C team. Like that all shifted the mood and the tone. And also because it was the Reagan 80s and then the Bush 80s and early 90s, that divide between the world of showbiz and the world of Washington was still very much present. The walls fall down, and then you just have journalists whoring after the supporting cast members of Caroline in the City, and
So I converted to Orthodox Judaism, and I could give you all sorts of explanations for why I did that with regard to ethics or theology or philosophy or whatever I come up with. But the truth is not fully reducible to words. I had an experience within Orthodox Judaism that lit me up, and my belief that Orthodox Judaism is true is not based on doctrines. It's not based on philosophy, right? It's not based on words. It's based on my tacit experience, lived experience from inside of Orthodox Judaism that just lights me up. And the advantage of this perspective is I don't need to protect anything in Orthodox Judaism. I welcome all critiques. I love truth. I love my life. My life experience convinces me of the divine truth of Orthodox Judaism, but that doesn't mean I need to defend absolutely anything in it. Right? There are certain things that are going to work for you that you will not be able to adequately put into words, and that doesn't make them any less profound.
Very unseemly, like weirdly unseemly, discomforting, as journalism itself is like, going through this nightmarish decline, and jobs are failing and new institutions are failing and becoming half of what they once were. And this is like this one moment when press self-congratulation got its like 3 hours in the sun, where and the press is giving awards to other members of the press, and everybody is talking about what brilliant reporting some completely hackish White House reporter did on a breaking news story about something or other that was literally no different from the other hack who wrote a story on the same subject but was better liked by the panel that chose the winner, and that sort of thing. So let's, but I mean, again,
if I could add one more detail from last night.
Yeah.
Every year there, I don't know if it was like this when you went there, but there are like protests, and you have to understand Connecticut Avenue is one of the large boulevards of Washington. So across there's like a divide in this two-lane at Connecticut Avenue. Yeah. So across from the Washington Hilton, there was a gaggle, I would say, of no more than maybe 30 people, but they were waving Palestinian, Iranian flags, and they were clearly there. There are a lot of things you could protest about President Trump and the media, of course.
I wish I had the money to fund a production of the following scene. So here's the title. The Coalition Will See You Now. Here's the scene. We have a Manhattan book study. It's lined with sacred books, right? And an Orthodox rabbi sits at his desk. He's wearing a dark suit. He's wearing a kippah. There's a small bust of Abraham Lincoln sitting prominently on his shelf. He's a modern Orthodox rabbi. He is mid-sentence. He's speaking to a camera, saying, as Lincoln said in his second inaugural, and as the prophet Isaiah said before him, and as my great-uncle the Rav said after both of them, and as I am saying right now in a way that connects all three, then knock, 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 right? Rabbi, the American experiment is a Hebraic donor bursts in wearing a tuxedo. Rabbi, quick question. Is the Republican Party good for the Jews? Rabbi, that's a profound question that requires yes or no, a textured engagement with Rabbi, the prophetic tradition. Rabbi, yes. Donor, excellent, writes a check. Then, donor exit, second knock. A bishop enters. Rabbi, we Catholics would love your thoughts on whether Jews and Christians share a common heritage. Rabbi, a magnificent question. In my forthcoming essay for First Things, do we share a common heritage? Yes. Bishop, wonderful. Exits. Third knock. A yeshiva student enters holding a volume of Talmud, a Gemara. Student, Rabbi, the documentary hypothesis, Wellhausen, Friedman, the archaeological evidence for a late composition of the Pentateuch. How do we? Rabbi, I have a meeting. You don't have a meeting. The Strauss Center has a meeting, but have you considered what Lincoln said about? Student, Lincoln didn't write the Torah. Student is gently escorted out by an unseen hand. Now there is a fourth knock. Rabbi, about the convention prayer, a ceremonial blessing in the tradition of Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, the candidate, which itself echoed the prophet Micah, every man under his vine and fig tree, and none shall make him afraid. So that's a yes? That's a textured engagement. The reporter exits, looking confused. A fifth knock. It's a young rabbi, bright-eyed. Young rabbi says, Rebbe, I want to write seriously about the crisis in modern Orthodoxy, the demographic collapse, the Haredi pressure, the intermarriage numbers outside the day school system. Have you considered Lincoln? What? Lincoln had many crises. I'm talking about our community. And yet he quoted the Psalms. Rebbe, I want to write what's true. My son, the truth is a coalition. And the coalition is the truth. That's circular. As Lincoln said, Lincoln wasn't Jewish. That is precisely why we must claim him. 6 knock, the dean enters. Rabbi, the donor from before has a friend, also Republican, also rich, also wants to know, yes. Haven't asked the question yet. Yes to the question. Wonderful, says the dean. Exits. The young rabbi stares at the older rabbi. Is this what it means to be a public intellectual? Rabbi, gazing wistfully out the window. My boy, once, long ago, I wrote a dissertation. It had arguments. It had footnotes. It engaged Rosenzweig. What happened? A single tear. Princeton. And then Commentary Magazine. And then the podcast. Rebbe. But as Lincoln said, and the Prophet Amos said, and as my great uncle the Rav said, and as I'm saying now in a way that connects all three. Cut to Graham Chapman as a British Army officer. Right, stop that. This is getting far too coalitional. Nobody's following an argument all the way through. I want a sketch where someone breaks with his donor base. Too depressing. Right, this sketch could not be completed due to coalition restraints.
But they were there because they wanted Iran to win the war, and they were there because they were on Team Hezbollah and Team Iran. Now, I take some comfort because you could only get 30 people. I mean, it was so in that sense, but they were loud enough, and I thought it was jarring in some ways to see people literally waving the Iranian flag. I think I saw a Hezbollah flag as well. But that was the
Katie Pavlich, the conservative media personality.
Yeah.
Had to cross the street, as you said. Connecticut's like, imagine essentially like a 6-lane highway, but it's a street.
Yes.
It's a street, and there's a concrete divider between the north, south, east, west, which are the two ways it's running, and she has to cross the street probably to get to her car, which is parked on the other side of Connecticut Avenue, and she has to sort of walk around this crowd, and somebody hit her on the head.
Oh,
like
wow.
Smashed her, like. Now, she said it wasn't clear whether that was intentional or not, but it was that kind of thing where they were out in public. They weren't penned up, right? It's not like in New York now where they basically
No, they weren't penned up. You could see them, and then as you were walking, because I mean, there's no point in trying to drive anywhere near the event because there is a lot of security. But as you were walking there, there were a few Code Pink, I don't know, volunteers who had like a pamphlet.
All right, here's another sketch that I'd love to fund. It's called The Earlobe Heresy. It's about why certain topics in criminology don't get discussed. So it's the academic office of Professor Margaret Crum, chair of critical criminology at the University of East Wessex. It's a dusty office. You got all these books by Foucault. Got a poster that reads "Biology is a Construct," and the professor is in a cardigan, sipping herbal tea, a knock, and in comes a 32-year-old graduate student. Professor Crum, thank you for seeing me. How is your work progressing on narratives of resistance among shoplifting single mothers in post-industrial Doncaster? Marvelous, Foucauldian, extensively, good lad. What did you want to discuss? Well, I'd like to change my topic. A pivot, splendid, queering the shoplift, perhaps, or intersectional. No, I want to do minor physical anomalies and recidivist violent offending. So minor physical anomalies mean, how come the most violent criminals tend to disproportionately have all these minor physical anomalies? And perhaps that's a reason that often we can tell at a glance whether someone is more or less likely to be dangerous. Minor physical anomalies. Is this a joke? Has someone put you up to this? Is this the economics department? I read a paper. You read a paper? Where did you find the PubMed? Listen to me. Public minor physical anomalies is not a field of studies. It is a disease. Killed a man in Leicester in 2007. We did not speak of him. His widow received a settlement. Graduate student says, I only want to measure earlobes. This is how it starts. The door bursts open. A man in a grey suit enters, flanked by 2 people in high visibility vests marked Institutional Review Board. We heard the word earlobes. Protocol dictates that any mention of measurable facial features in a criminology context triggers a level 3 ethics review. He will have to fill in Form 47B. Is that the long one? 71 pages. Page 43 asks you to account for Lombroso. So Lombroso is the guy who was the major thinker behind physiognomy. Grad student says, well, I was going to distinguish my work from Lombroso by, then the door bursts open. 3 cardinals enter in red robes. First cardinal, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Second cardinal, our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. And a moral panic about race science. Third cardinal, and ruthless efficiency. First cardinal, our 3 chief weapons are, yes, thank you, cardinals, we have rather a situation. First cardinal, does not look like a criminal. Second cardinal, that's a problem, he looks like a Volvo driver. Third cardinal, if he looked like a criminal, we could send him away, nobody would mind. Do you have any cousins in prison, young man? Well, my uncle Derek was once fined for fishing without a license. Then Cesar Lombroso crawls out of a filing cabinet. Victorian dress, calipers in hand. Calipers where you measure various facial characteristics. Did someone say my name? I heard my name. No, get back in the cabinet. Let me see your forehead, boy. I'd rather you didn't. Then we have Foucault's ghost floating in, semi-transparent. Monsieur, the body is described by power. To measure the ear is to reinscribe the cursorial gaze upon the very... Not now. All right, the graduate student. You will need a Form 92C, eugenics disavowal, Form 116, Lombroso non-affiliation, and a short essay titled Why I Am Not a Fascist. How short? 40,000 words. But I only want to look at earlobes. Trying to help you. Pick another topic. Queer phenomenology of the CCTV. The semiotics of the tagged hoodie. Critical race theory of the traffic cone. I'll sign off on any of those today. But the Danish data, the Danes are not to be trusted. They have a king. They eat pastry. Their cohort studies ruin lives. Foucault, the archive is never innocent. Professor, I've read the literature. The effect size are modest. I won't overclaim. I'll caveat everything. I just think someone should check whether the Montreal mouth finding of these minor physical anomalies replicates in a British cohort. His professor says, my dear boy, you believe that good work protects its author. It does not. If you publish this thesis, no department of criminology in the English-speaking world will hire you. Your mother will receive phone calls. Your name will appear on a list. The list has 17 other names on it. 12 of them drive Ubers. 3 are in Hungary. 2 teach at Liberty University and lie about it at Christmas. Will I still get my funding stipend? No. It's been reallocated to a new project. What project? Narratives of resistance among shoplifting single mothers in post-industrial Doncaster. Yes. So that's how I've been spending my time.
Suggesting that Pete Hegseth should be arrested. That was the other one.
Right.
As you're sort of going in. But every year there are these protests, and I always find it interesting, what are they protesting about? And this year it was like the protest was Team Intifada against the Washington Press Corps and, all these Washington elites.
So bouncing around to point out in Trump's statement that he made from the White House press room, he explicitly connected Iran to the event. He said, when they said, why did this happen? Why would this guy do it? And he said, I don't know. He said, I think he's a lone gunman. He's sick. He's very sick. These people are sick. And, so rather than saying, this was, this was an effort to, sort of disrupt history or something like that. He did go with the crazy lone gunman theory, but he also said, I'm here trying to make sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And I don't really understand why. Basically said, I don't really understand why that's controversial. I don't understand why anybody wouldn't support that idea. And that gets to the point about the protesters that you're making, which is you can say the war's a mistake. You can say that, it was ill-considered, I suppose. I don't say any of those things. But that's within the bounds of realm of a proper conversation.
Yeah.
But the idea that all things being equal, any civilized human being would not prefer...
Okay, by popular demand, here we go. Another lecture hall. Professor at a podium. Behind him, a blackboard reads, Carl Schmitt, friend or enemy? A methodological inquiry into whether we may proceed. He adjusts his notes for 45 seconds in silence. Professor, I should like to begin, if I may, and I think you'll agree that I may, by saying, in the clearest possible terms, that I do not endorse what I am about to say. Student, what are you about to say? Haven't decided yet, but whatever it is, I wish to distance myself from it preemptively. He writes, disavowal on the blackboard, underlines it 3 times. Professor, now, Carl Schmitt. Long pause. Brilliant. Shorter pause. Appalling. Pause. Brilliant. I think we can all agree on the sequence. Student, well, can we use him or not? Professor, visibly relieved that someone asked. Excellent question. The answer is yes, provided one has first said no. You say no in the footnote, a short note, firm but not aggressive. Then you proceed as if the no had resolved everything. But does the no resolve anything? Well, it resolves your position within this institution, which is the more pressing concern. Second professor enters, slightly out of breath. I've just written a paper using SCHMITT. Did you disavow? Extensively. How many words? 112. Per footnote? Total. Oof, cutting it fine. What was the paper on? The exception as a structural feature of constitutional order and its implications for contemporary democratic theory. And you manage that with 112 words of disavowal? Well, I said deeply problematic twice. Well, that's the equivalent of 40 words each. You're probably fine. Student, if Carl Schmitt's theory of the exception describes how a community defines itself against an enemy and we define ourselves against Schmitt, doesn't that mean that Schmitt's theory is correct and we are merely demonstrating it? Professor, well, that observation, while interesting, is itself problematic. You disavowing my question? Professor, I am contextualizing it within a framework that preserves our ability to continue. Continue what? The seminar, the department, the post-war liberal consensus. Third professor bursts in carrying a large stack of papers. Chantal Mouffe is here. Chantal Mouffe is one of the leading academic writers on Carl Schmitt. Professor, has she disavowed? She's thinking with him against him. That's the advanced technique. You need at least 15 years in the field before attempting that. She says the enemy becomes an adversary. So she's kept the structure, but she's changed the wallpaper. That's what Giorgio Agamben did too, except he made Schmitt the villain of his own theory. Elegant. That way you get to use the knife while blaming the knife for cutting. Student, none of this seems to be about Carl Schmitt anymore. It seems to be about whether we're allowed to talk about Carl Schmitt. Correct. This is political theory. What about the engagement, about sovereignty, about the exception? Well, that comes in week 9. Well, what happens in weeks 1 through 8? It's all about the disavowal technique. Now, who can tell me the difference between a firm disavowal and a performative one? So a firm disavowal says, I reject this. A performative disavowal says, I reject this. By saying so, I am the kind of person who rejects this, which is the kind of person who can now safely use this. Right? This second is more useful. Well, what if someone doesn't disavow Carl Schmitt at all? The room goes quiet. Then we do not speak of them. Not at all, Professor. We cite them to note that they have not disavowed. That is the correct procedure. We cite them to mark the boundary of the acceptable. But isn't that what Carl Schmitt says the sovereign does? Professor, I'm going to need you to write a disavowal of that question before next Tuesday.
That the regime in Iran not have a nuclear weapon, and that efforts to make sure that that happen are, all things being equal, moral and just, even if they might be politically unsound or tactically foolish or something like that. It was interesting that he went there. He didn't have to do it. He didn't have to mention Iran at all. And he did, and he wanted to make that connection, and he wanted to use this moment to say, I'm really serious about this. Like, it's on my mind as I'm standing here, Iran, you know, like.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it, because I was thinking about the Vietnam protests before these dinners. And of course, Jane Fonda does go on a disgusting propaganda tour with the Viet Cong and urges prisoners of war to give up and everything like that. And that was gross. But there was a huge backlash in the United States, even I think among the anti-war movement. The main anti-war thing that really gets going in like 67, 68 is like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
I've been putting all my essays in an academic register to make sure that not too many people read them, right? Make sure that the great unwashed can't read them. I try to make them as difficult as possible just to try to drive my numbers down. And among the great things that I've been producing on my blog over the past week is this learned paper, Platform, Pulpit, Archive, 3 models of modern Orthodox rabbinic self-presentation in Los Angeles. And you're wondering, is that as exciting as it sounds? And it is. So here's the most explicit self-promoting modern Orthodox rabbinic website I can find in Los Angeles. Maverick Mystics and False Messiahs now available. This is Rabbi Penny Dunner, a thoroughly engaging introduction to some of the most colorful episodes of Jewish history. Wonderfully enjoyable read. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. So as soon as I hear anyone citing Jonathan Sacks, I expect someone who's shallow, right? When people cite Jonathan Sacks or Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, usually I recognize that I'm dealing with someone who's fairly shallow. Rabbi Penny Dunner is among the most thoughtful and articulate voices of centrist orthodoxy today. One of the most vibrant voices of our time is the voice of Rabbi Penny. He is a voice that speaks to the heart and to the head. Robert Davey, Hollywood actor. Now, well, may you think that this sort of self-promotion is unbecoming for a rabbi. And it does seem a tad jarring. Rabbi Dunner's expertise spans the worlds of academia, media, business, and the timeless wisdom of Judaism. So what the heck is going on here? And there's a bargain that every modern Orthodox rabbi in Los Angeles with a website faces, right? He needs visibility to hold donors, congregants, and peers. He needs restraint to pass himself off as a servant of Torah rather than as a personal brand. He knows that the Jewish tradition condemns cultivation of personal honor. He knows that the attention economy rewards that cultivation. So each site marks where a rabbi settles on that tension. So this is Rabbi Penny Dunner on the most extreme end. Right? This is a rabbi-first platform, all about him, his biography, his lineage, his media presence. And he's a rabbi in Beverly Hills. But there are other approaches that are far more common. So this is the other end. This is Rabbi Yitzhak et Shalom. And this is much more typical of the Orthodox rabbinic website, right? Very plain, very little self-praise. It's just Torah, Torah, Torah. So most Orthodox rabbi websites look like etshalom.com. Here the teacher disappears behind his audio files and his analyses of Torah. Then you have all the institutional sites that host their rabbis inside of congregational structures and ask 4 coalition questions when you want to properly situate someone, right? Who does this person rely on for status? Right? What coalition do they depend on for status and income? Who do they risk angering if they speak plainly? Who benefits if their story, if their framing, if their narrative wins? What truth would cost them their position? So once you ask these questions, a lot of confusion disappears. So if you're hearing from an epidemiologist during a public health crisis, he's not just an expert, he's embedded in a grant system, in professional bodies, in journals, in regulatory relations. So his incentives will skew heavily towards maintaining consensus and moral reassurance. A journalist at the New York Times is not a neutral observer, right? They are part of a reputation economy where being early and wrong is punished much harder than being late and aligned with his coalition. So people tend to believe that which is convenient for them and that which their coalition will reward. Right? You speak out against your coalition, your tribe, your brand, you will get pushed out of the coalition or tribe, at least onto the margins.
Meaning, it was not like they were in favor of North. It was like our boys are getting killed in this meat grinder, and which again, like I think that's unfair. You can say whatever you want about it, but that's I guess a kind of, you can see how that was a kind of patriotic protest as opposed to literally waving the flag of the enemy like that. And of course, there were elements of the Vietnam protests that did end up getting to that point. Like the Weather Underground was pro Viet Cong and pro North Vietnam, but it was not the mainstream of the anti-war movement was not that at all. They just didn't think it was worth it, and they didn't like the draft, and they didn't want young
Same applies.
Americans to die.
Same applies during the Bush years,
Right.
where the war protest. I mean, what we're seeing now in terms of protesting the war as opposed to Trump is nothing compared to what we saw during Iraq. When Iraq,
I mean, that's a very interesting. Of course, we did have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, on the battlefield in the two Iraq wars, and we don't.
But there is. But you could compare it to Iran also.
But just also to Eli's point, they weren't pro-Taliban. They weren't pro-Saddam. That was not the argument. That was you would never hear such a thing whispered.
Right.
But
that was like
I covered the
Ahmadinejad
speech at Columbia, and at the Ahmadinejad speech at Columbia, the flyers around the quad.
That was 2007. Yeah.
The flyers around the quad were flyers.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Joey Jones, along with Tommy Lahren, Alicia Acuna, Kevin Cork, and welcome to an extended edition of the Big Weekend Show. And the big story tonight is a Fox News alert. Authorities are searching the California home of 31-year-old Cole Allen, who was arrested for opening fire at the White House Correspondents' dinner last night. Law enforcement is trying to identify the motive behind his attack and are going door to door in search for answers. President Trump and Vice President Vance were forced to evacuate the event last night. And one Secret Service agent was shot in the attack but was saved by his bulletproof vest. Luckily, that agent has already been released from the hospital. President Trump addressed the nation shortly after the attack.
And charged a security checkpoint armed with multiple weapons, incredibly acted upon by Secret Service and law enforcement. And this was an event dedicated to freedom of speech that was supposed to bring together members of both parties with members of the press.
Yeah, it's a big, big weekend.
Yes, well, it did bring everyone together, right? When you're all afraid for your life, I would expect that brings a feeling of togetherness.
And show. So we have Team Fox coverage with Bill Maloogian, Christina Coleman, C.B. Cotton, and Rich Edson standing by. And first, we're going to go to Alex Hogan, who's live at the White House. Alex.
Hi, Joey. President Trump is here at the White House today, although we do not expect to see him for the rest of the day, though he did praise the Secret Service earlier today on Fox about their quick response last night at the White House Correspondents' dinner.
Secret Service and all law enforcement I thought they were outstanding. You know, you can always take a nitpick and
Man, it's so much harder to develop ideas or to break them down on a live stream compared to writing. So honestly, I want to get back to writing. I want to get back to editing. I want to get back to chatting with AI. And I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.